Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Zero to Empire podcast. On this episode, I have Stever Robbins, and he's an executive coach. And on this episode, we're going to be talking about his background, what inspired him to become an executive coach, and everything that led into that coming to where he is today. So, Stever, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being on. And what actually led you, or what experience made you become an executive coach today?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me. Um, I became an executive coach because of my skill set. Actually, prior to being an executive coach, I was an entre. Well, these days it's all the rage to say I was an entrepreneur. I was with a series of startups. I've been with a total of 9 startups over the course of my career, and I was usually in the early ones. I was a programmer, and then a manager of programmers, and then later I got into the business world. And when I was on, I think my 7th startup, it was me and a group of newly minted MBAs. Now, as I said, this was around my 7th startup, and this was their first, and they had just received their degrees a few months earlier. Let's just say they were gung ho, they were confident, they were charging headlong into an industry that they had no experience with. In a startup environment, none of them had even worked in a startup. They were all big company people. Um, and they were just going to make it all happen. Now, once you've been with a number of companies of any sort, startup or not, once you've been with someone, you've seen some companies that do things well and some that don't, and where the problem points are, you start to see that there are very common problem points that similar companies all have. And by this time, with the particular company that I'm talking about, I could see they were already starting to make the same mistakes that I had lived through a bunch of times. And I'm like, really, really? So I went to them and I said in my most confident voice, you're really about to hit a brick wall at 90 miles an hour, the same way several other companies have. And I've seen this movie before, and I can just give you some skills, and I can give you some processes, and I can give you some project management techniques, and we can avoid this, and we can have smooth sailing. And they looked at me with a straight face and said, well, you just don't know what it takes to run a startup. And I'm like, actually, this is my 7th and your first, and you've never worked at a startup, and you're a newly minted MBA, so you've never even had business responsibility. And they said, well, that doesn't matter. So long story short, they didn't listen to me. And I still remember shortly before I quit, I was talking to the chief operating officer, and there was something that was going wrong, something completely avoidable. And we were talking, and without stopping to think about what he was saying, he said, God, it would be so great if we actually had somebody with, relevant prior experience who could be here and tell us how. And he gets this far in the sentence and looks me in the eye and he's like, and tell us how we should be doing things to avoid all of these problems. But of course, if we had such a person, we probably would have ignored them at every possible opportunity. And I was like, yes, you would have. And so I left. I mean, not that day, but I left shortly thereafter. And I went to my mentor and I said, Len, I don't understand. I had so much to offer these people, and it was so obvious that they were hitting these problems and whatever. I'm like, what I do wrong. And he made an observation, and this is the observation that led me to pivot from having an operating role to being a coach. And his observation was, he says that you're a process thinker. Now, what a process thinker is somebody who concentrates on how things get done rather than what's getting done. So as a process thinker, what that means is when I come into a company, when I come in to deal with a person, it doesn't matter. I mean, this is literally the way my brain is wired. I'm always thinking, gee, what are the steps that this person or this system or this company are going through to get the results that they want? So let's say that I were coming into a company, and the company were having a big cost cutting effort. And they were saying, oh, look, we found $100 worth of cost savings in department X. As a process thinker, I wouldn't start by saying, "Oh, great, you found $100 worth of savings." What the very first thing my brain would go is, "Aha! How are you deciding that Department X is the place you should be examining, and how are you searching for the cost savings? Because there are some ways of searching for cost savings that will find you high quality cost savings, and other ways of searching for it that will find you low quality cost savings or cost savings that will break things, as we might even be seeing on a national level as we record this." But basically, my brain automatically goes to process. There's only one problem with that, which is that I'm always thinking about how things are getting done and how to improve it. Most people don't care. They really don't care. The last thing they want to hear is how they need to change their behavior. They want to simply keep doing the thing that they have always been doing or the thing that occurs to them and get the same result. So inside of an organization, they didn't want to listen to me because they were just so gung ho and so excited. The last thing they wanted, even if it was accurate, was to be told that they were heading in the wrong direction. And my mentor looked at me and he said, if you're a process thinker, you need to have a role that values the process thought, that values your ability to come into a situation, untangle the pieces, and align them. And so he said, you need to be something like a consultant or a coach. And I went out and actually hired an executive coach for myself. And I said, help me please find my next career. I'm ready for a big change. And essentially, she came to the same conclusion. She said, the way that you think, you produce far more value working with somebody on their thinking, working with somebody on their approach to their life, to their business, to the way that they make decisions, to the way that they deal with uncertainty. That's where you really shine. And any given organization doesn't need that on an ongoing basis. They need a little bit here, a little bit there. So you should be somebody who does this on a contract basis, and you may as well be an executive coach. And this was 1999, so executive coaching was still a fairly rare thing. You didn't have everyone and their brother calling themselves an executive coach. And I shifted into that business. The first incarnation of my business was called Venture Coach. And I think the website isn't there anymore. I think the domain still exists because I specialized in high growth funded entrepreneurial ventures. So specifically the needs of people in the first third of their career who were starting a funded venture. Their strategy and their path was high growth, rapid hiring, growth of capacity, growth of customer base, etc. And they as individuals and as a management team needed to be able to up their game very, very rapidly because the skills that they're going to need 10 months from now when they are 50% larger are not the same skills they need now. It's going to be a relevant shift. And that was how I got my start, was through coaching.
Yeah, that's one inspiring story, and I'm glad that you're here today helping other people change their lives. And what a quite a journey with all this startups and not or people not taking your advice as a byproduct of you doing all this. And can you actually tell us a client story of yours that has made an impact on you thus so far?
Sure. The funny part is this was one of my very first clients, may have actually been my very first client. And it is a story that spans everything. It spans kind of all the aspects of what I've ever done with someone. Was in this very first, person out of the gate. I was hired to work with a project manager who was seen as a very high potential leader in the organization, and her ambition was to be on the executive committee of the company. But she wasn't there yet in terms of her ability to think strategically, her ability to think big picture, etc. So I worked with her and we got her to advance through the company, and ultimately she ended up on the executive committee. And that felt good for both of us. But I was like, yay, this we have achieved her goal. And then a few months later, she called me up and she said, I really like to be closer to the work itself. I'm not finding a lot of satisfaction in this sort of big picture, amorphous strategic level. I want to be there getting things done, producing product, working directly with the teams and directly with our customers. Could you help me downshift? And she's like, however, I want to downshift without losing status. So how do I do that without it being seen as a failure? So I worked with her to downshift. And then she came back to me about a year later, if I remember correctly. And she said, I've decided it's time for major life change. I want to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. And I was like, okay, warning in advance. I have enough trouble climbing up the steps to my apartment. I am not sure that I can coach you through Mount Kilimanjaro. But of course, it wasn't actually the how do you climb the mountain that she needed and wanted coaching on. It was everything about mentally preparing not just for that, but for what this might mean for her career. She was suddenly taking an absence, about the uncertainty of taking a leap. Long story short, she sent me a picture of herself. She didn't quite summit. She got very, very close, but altitude sickness got her. But she was within, I think, 500 feet, and she sent me a selfie, and she said, couldn't have done it without you. That that is the thing that, of all the people that I have worked with, and I have some that are I have some that are more businessy success stories, but in her case, it was really her journey that I found inspiring and that I'm really proud of.
Yeah, that's really sweet that you're able to help or mentally prepare her for that. That's really cool, and I can't imagine doing that either, hiking up. But when it
Yeah,
comes to who's your ideal coaching clients today, who are they, and how has that evolved?
sure. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, it was high growth entrepreneurs, and then I moved after the internet crash in 2000. A lot of the venture capital money dried up, and a lot of high growth entrepreneurs suddenly discovered that they didn't have enough money to keep the lights on, much less to hire an executive coach for themselves. So I shifted more into doing leadership coaching with people in mid-sized companies, and by mid-size I would say I don't judge a company by revenues. I judge a company by the size of the company because complexity by the head count, because complexity increases as head count. It doesn't necessarily increase as dollar value unless the dollar value causes headcounts to boost or causes complexity. Um, so then did a lot of work with kind of mid-sized companies, some executives, some CEOs, some people who again were being targeted. So I'm really about the preparing yourself for the global view of the business. And then I've also had many people who were self-employed and wanting to grow. So they're like, okay, I need to find a way to scale my business model. I then need to have a team. I've never managed people before. I've never hired people before, et cetera, et cetera. And um, I would say currently those are the people who I am really looking for are people who are either pivoting careers or people who are in a career but about to hit a growth inflection point, and they need to be able to take a bigger picture view of their business, a bigger picture view of the world, and potentially a bigger picture view of themselves. Because, it's funny that you sort of hear things like, oh, you have to believe in yourself first. And have you ever asked yourself why? Like, why do you have to believe in yourself first? Why can't you just go do the thing and have it work, even if you don't believe in yourself? And the answer to that comes down to certain things having to do with the ability to recognize opportunity and with the ability to make decisions. Because when our brains are filtering for opportunity, or when they're filtering for options when we're making a decision, they filter that through our sense of identity and our sense of capability. So, I mean, I'll use a slightly metaphoric but real life example. I grew up in a traveling New Age polyamorous hippie commune, and I had certainly seen television shows where people talked to other, where there were people who were wearing tuxedos and were drinking out of little crystal goblets, and they had titles like ambassador, and I was just kind of like I knew those people existed, right? Like, of course, there are people who are ambassadors, but in my mind, they were so far removed from me and who I was and what I was doing and what I was doing that my brain never made any kind of connection. When I thought, gee, who do I want to hang out with this weekend? I never thought, wouldn't it be nice to hang out with the ambassador to the court of St. James? I'll bet he's a really interesting guy. Nope, didn't cross my mind. It was more like, oh, I wonder if my friend Mike will be allowed to go play pinball with me this weekend. So part of where your sense of identity really comes in and becomes really important, especially if you're in a company that's growing, is being able to grow your identity in a way that allows you to identify opportunities and allows you to do stretch goals without becoming a jerk. Because at least currently, there's a lot of, particularly in Silicon Valley, is where I'm thinking of. There are a lot of people who there's a lot of people who limit themselves by having too small a sense of identity. There's also a lot of people who limit themselves by having a little bit too large of one, and they don't recognize or understand their own limitations, which means when they're in one of those decision making scenarios or an opportunity recognition scenarios, they end up either identifying things that they're not able to do or overpromising and underdelivering. And both of those are long-term drivers of failure. So that's again part of what I do is I work with, you asked who my ideal clients are. They are people who are on the cusp of that, and they need to up their systems, they need to up their business, they need to up their concept of who they are and who they can be in the world. And they need to do so in a way that is effective, that leads them to make better choices, that leads them to be more ambitious, and that leads them to also be a good and wonderful and pleasant person to hang out with. And by the way, just for the record, the kid from the polyamorous hippie commune has in fact hung out with the ambassador from the court of St. James, and he's a very nice person.
Wow, that's really cool. And I'm glad that you niched down to them, and I'm glad you're helping them out. And
Well,
so before
well,
this,
that actually gets to later in my story where I started actually traveling in different circles and how which I don't think was on our question list, but we can talk about that if you're interested.
yes,
Sorry,
go
I've
ahead.
almost changed the topic there.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So, I guess the part that isn't obvious from my story so far is I ended up going to MIT for undergrad in engineering and then to Harvard Business School for my master's, obviously in business. And one of the things that was interesting about both of those is they put me in environments where I was dealing with people unlike people I had ever dealt with before. And those people, they had different conversations, and they had conversations about different things in different ways. And in fact, I have a current theory of both. I have a current theory of personal change and of how you can change your life. Um, I was one day talking to Ted Turner, who was the founder of CNN, and um, we had just met. We'd met at a conference, and we had this nice conversation. And then he walked off in one direction, and I walked off in another direction. And I jokingly thought to myself, "Wow, my entire life has led up to me meeting Ted Turner right here in this hallway." And then I thought, and his entire life led up to him getting to meet me right here in this hallway. And then it struck me, well, why does he get to go off and be Ted Turner and I go off and be Stever Robbins? Why can't I go off and be Ted Turner right now? Because he was heading into a conference of world leaders to talk about nuclear disarmament. I mean, literally, that was where he was going after our conversation. Whereas I was going back to my room and I was hoping to open a little snack pack that has a few pieces of tasty, delicious lunch meat and maybe a couple slices of American cheese. And I thought, why am I the one who's going to be stuck with the bologna and the American cheese, and he's the one that gets to go hang with President Clinton? Well, the answer is because, as far as I can tell, once you're no longer on the front line of anything, like once you're at a manager level or above those kinds of roles in your life, the only thing people do is they have conversations about topics with other people. That's it. Almost everything other than doing an actual skill comes down to that. And the thing is you need to get the right other people to listen to you. And you need to have conversations about the things that are important to you and the things that are important to them. And if you're having those conversations with the right people, you're Ted Turner. If the topic is nuclear disarmament and the person is President Clinton, because Clinton, actually, I think this was after he was president, but he still goes by the title. Then you're Ted Turner. And if your conversation is, darn it, I can't get the cellophane off of the bologna lunch, could you please hand me that plastic knife off of the tea tray in the hotel room, then you're Stever Robbins. So if what you're trying to do is up your identity, if you go to an MIT or to a Harvard Business School, all of a sudden you start having different conversations with different people. You have conversations with people, one of my best friends from Harvard Business School was a woman who had been the executive assistant to the head of Goldman Sachs being the investment bank. Now, in an extraordinarily bizarre twist of fate, 15 years later, the chief financial officer of Goldman Sachs turned out to be the kid who I was frenemies with in 8th grade, which is just bizarre. But back when I met my other friend, I didn't know yet that my frenemy was about to become the senior executive, one of the senior executives there. My friend at Harvard Business School, she had been the executive assistant to the head of Goldman Sachs. So she was accustomed to really high level conversations about world level events and world level phenomena. She could talk quite seriously and with experience in these kinds of conversations about moving vast sums of money, about the financial status of entire countries. And those weren't conversations that people in my household had had. So going to MIT and then going to HBS really awakened me to the power of learning how to have these different conversations, learning how to approach people and connect with people, and learning really how to up your game with people, right? Which I went through that process myself, which is one of the big reasons that is a big thing that I do with people now as well. Because wow, actually, you know what? When I think about it, I don't market my business that way, but I'm thinking like my last four clients have all been of that type. I can't say specifics, but yeah, because one person went to a senior government post, um, not under the Trump administration, under a previous administration. Um, Another one, yeah, okay. So apparently I do that a bunch, but a lot of it is really teaching people to talk and think at the right level to be able to connect with whatever their next phase of growth is. So if they're a mid-sized company and they want to grow to be a multi-state, multinational, whatever, part of it is learning the language. What are the things that people talk about? How are negotiations conducted, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, if I don't have experience in something, I help people find the people who do, and or et cetera. So did that answer your
Yeah.
question? Oh my gosh, I'm like rambling.
No, that's a very awesome story, and I appreciate it. And when it comes to the Harvard MBA curriculum that you actually
Yeah.
redesigned, what was that like?
So that happened a few years out of HBS. I had one of my professors at HBS. We'd become friends, and he had supervised my big final project. And after I left HBS, I started sending him faxes. So this was before email was really widespread. And and what the faxes contained is they contained my observations about how my Harvard Business School education was not preparing me for a lot of the realities of the real world. And I called these the facts of life. That's FAX, the facts of life. Saturday Night Live, here I come. So I was sending him these, and these were, they started off as, here is how my MBA failed me. And they later became ruminations on, wow, here are the things I'm learning in the real world, and these are the things that should be taught by HBS. Several years later, he was put in charge of a redesign of the HBS curriculum. And he called me up and he said, hey, Stever, would you like to come help redesign the HBS curriculum? And I said, what's in it for me? And he said, well, you could take, I can guarantee you'll get an 80% pay cut. And I was like, oh, okay, that sounds interesting. And any mistakes that you make will be blamed on you, and any mistakes that anyone else makes will also be blamed on you. And I'm like, all right, this is sounding like a more and more interesting opportunity. And I said, so anything else? And he said, oh, yes, anything you do that works, other people will take credit for, often the very same people who will blame you for their mistakes. And I was like, great, you've just about sold me. Is there any upside to this job at all? And he said, yes, you are going to get to influence the way the entire next generation of Harvard MBAs think, behave, and approach problems. And I said, 80% pay cut, here I come. Um, if you, so for anyone listening, if you're not familiar with the concept of leverage, I'm not talking about financial leverage. I'm talking about leverage in action. Leverage is when you can put in a small amount of effort and you put it in at exactly the right place, and it creates gigantic ripple effects. And Harvard MBAs, for better or worse, generally leave the school and step into positions of tremendous influence over businesses, over governments, and over many, many other people's lives, which means that a small change in how a Harvard MBA makes decisions could result in sweeping changes societally globally economically. So I made that my mission during the time we were redesigning the curriculum. I was the co I was kind of the co-chair of one of the design teams. We were working on the first few weeks of the curriculum, the last few weeks of the curriculum. So all of the background skills that we wanted people to have in order to get the most from the curriculum itself. And it was an absolutely fascinating experience. And it really gave me an appreciation for what are the foundational skills that you need to be able to build a world class global manager. And yeah, it was an awesome experience. I really loved it. And I am very proud to say that one of the modules that I was pretty much 100% responsible for was so impactful for people that I've met MBAs since, and I've said, "Oh, how did you like it?" And they did not know that I had helped design it. And they would say, "Well, the whole thing was great, but there was this one part in particular that was life changing for me, and I still see the people who I did it with, and we're still best friends." And they would then name the piece that I did. And I'll tell you, there's nothing quite like there's nothing quite like knowing that you have such a transformational effect on people's lives, I guess. So I became kind of a want to help people truly up their game at a huge level guy, which is a little annoying because now that's kind of my baseline. Whereas if my baseline was something like, gee, I would like to help people improve their income by 0.02% per year, that would be a heck of a lot easier to find clients. But no, I'm into the ambitious, want to change the world for the better people. That's the other thing is I have to, you know, I have to say that I do have a bias, which is that I like people whose concern is to genuinely improve the world, because I don't think we have enough of that.
Yeah, that's really great that you're focusing on people that want to change the world, and it's super unique what you do with the Harvard program. So that's really neat that you did that all. And where can those actually interested in becoming your client find and reach out to you by?
Well, if you want to become my client or if you just want to say hi, you can go to steverrobbins.com, which I think is on, yes, it's on the screen, steverrobbins.com. And then in the upper right hand corner, there is a contact drop down menu. And I think I believe you can send me email through that. You can also subscribe to my newsletter. I would invite you to subscribe to the newsletter. Normally, I would have a special magical link all set up and giveaway for you and all those great things. Unfortunately, as we were talking about before we started this, my entire tech stack blew up this week for various reasons, but at least the contact form and the newsletter sign up are still working. So if you sign up for those, I will find some way to get you something, and I will respond if you have any comments, questions. Happy to hop on the phone for an informational discussion, free of charge, just to find out who you are and what you're about, and tell you who I am and what I'm about, and see if there's a match and if there's a way we can meet each other.
That's solid. Go check him out at his website. Contact him. And yeah, thanks so much, Stever, for being on this episode of Zero to Empire. And for everyone listening and watching in, thank you as well. And I'll see you on the next one.
Thank you very much.